How do you feel when you're about to head into a job interview? Anxious? Excited? A little of each? Well, as candidates, we always want to make a good impression, right? But these days, with more than double the number of schools than there were 10 years ago, the international school recruiting landscape has become very competitive, with the total number of available jobs far outpacing the number of applicants. According to our guest, LLoyd French, we're clearly looking at a teacher's market. The onus is now on the schools to impress us. LLoyd works for Teachaway in the position of advising schools on how they can better present themselves to applicants. Please check out the show notes to learn more about LLoyd and his international journey. We drew on a webinar that LLoyd created to help international schools present themselves in the best possible light. So in this episode, we flip perspectives from the schools to the applicants looking at the schools and how well they are presenting themselves. LLoyd covered several criteria, but they're not limited to what I'm going to share here. We really did cover a lot. So here we go for some of the criteria. The schools should have some sort of digital presence, definitely be accredited. You should be able to find positive reviews out there on the internet and other places in your network. There definitely should be transparency from the school in sharing documents and resources and where you can get more information and learn about the school and the community. There should be a willingness to connect you with current faculty, and that the leadership team has a positive vibe and it's clear that they have a productive relationship with staff. LLoyd really helped us to reimagine the application and interviewing process. So what was our big takeaway? Well, schools should be making it clear that they want us. This episode was recorded on April 24th, 2023. We now give you LLoyd French.
Hi, LLoyd. Welcome to Educators Going Global. Let's start off with you telling us where in the world you are.
Hi, both of you. It's great to be here. I'm currently in York, in England, in the northeast, having recently returned actually just before the pandemic from living in China.
Amazing. Well, you know what we think is pretty cool to mark this episode? This is our most far-flung episode in terms of geography. I'm in Jamaica, David is in Vietnam, and you kind of split the difference there in Britain, so that's really fun.
We're spanning all time zones. I think
we are.
You got the short straw, I'm sure, in the morning with coffee.
It's so good to be up and going. So we're wondering if you have a going global story that you would like to share with us today.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, me and my family, we were living in China actually before we returned back home here in the UK. And I guess one unique thing is probably more of a family-related experience, but my wife, Alice, she actually fell pregnant when we were in China. She's a primary school teacher and she's working out there. And so, as you can imagine, that was our first child. The general emotions anyway of probably having the birth of your first child high anyway. But then sort of after the fact, it was looking at, well, okay, what does this mean? Obviously, we're lucky here in the UK, the NHS is, great in that respect. Your scans are scheduled by the midwives. It's a really seamless process. But over there, we just didn't know what would happen, what we'd have to do. So, first of all, looking into even the health insurance we had, where we covered for maternity policies and healthcare, and what did it involve? And from the onset, actually, it turned out we weren't covered. So dang. That wasn't the best scenario. But taking that into account, I mean, we'd already had plans. She was actually finishing close that summer to a 2-year contract. We had already considered if we were going to stay or not. And I think that prompted us to know at the end of that, we're going to come home. But even in the interim, we did all of our scans over there. One unique thing which I learned Obviously, it's no longer a policy, but back in the days with the one-child policy in China, if you go for scans, they're not allowed to reveal the gender by
Right.
law. Indicative of the one-child policy, there was kind of geared towards a certain gender at times.
Yes.
And so we were really excited. We want to find out.
Oh.
So thankfully, we had a nice doctor who kind of gave us a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But it was quite the experience. And now Emily, she's coming on 4, about to be 4 years old. And I'm sure we'll be telling her through her life that technically she lived in China once upon a time as well.
But she's a girl, so it's a good thing he was covert about that.
Exactly. I won't share his exact wording, but it was food related, to use an analogy of the gender. And I thought, okay, I'm with you.
I love that
gosh.
story.
That is kind of the inside culture on how things used to work. And now China is drastically going, we don't have enough young people. And they obviously switched out of that one child per family policy. So that's quite the change since then. So Lloyd, we have a huge guiding question for you. And what we want to do is flip the usual question for our teachers and administrators who listen to us, who often feel the pressure of what qualities should I have to best present myself to an international school, to flip it to what attributes should an international school exhibit to stand out for applicants. So we're going to flip it around. If you can give us the rundown on your guidance in schools that you work with Teachaway to present themselves in the best light. So let's break this down into some questions. And in the introduction to this episode, there was information about the webinar that you put together when you're advising schools, in a sense, how to up their game in the very competitive recruiting world of international schools. So let's start with your giving us your take on the recruiting landscape as you see it now, regarding your observation of it being a teacher's market.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that's something, as a statement, what we share with schools year in, year out, probably have done, certainly for the last couple of years. And there's been a big shift. I think when we go back to the history of the international education sector, certainly as it pertains to international schools, they were historically predicated for embassy-related schools, catering towards really diplomats and expat children, operating an international curriculum so they could still maintain that learning pathway they may have had back in their domicile country. Whereas when you fast forward to now, not only has there been a drastic increase in the number of international schools, I believe in the last decade or so, nearly 60% increase, nearly 8,000 new international schools opening up, and that number continues to grow. However, on the flip side of that, you've got this teacher shortages, which I'm sure everybody and all the listeners are well aware of, in that there's many teachers leaving the profession, especially in markets like the US and the UK, draw very similar parallels. I think the Department of Education here in the UK states that actually they've seen a 40% decline in really candidates undertaking PGCEs and becoming qualified teachers. And I believe that's similar statistics out in the US. And then of those actually really qualifying in the profession within the first few years, that they're leaving again. And there's really, I guess, a variety of reasons. But to go back to that statement of why it's become a teacher's market is you've got this really, I guess, the simplest terms is supply and demand, where there's a growing population of international schools, which has changed in its essence in that now it's catering predominantly for a local student body because that's in demand in a lot of markets. But traditionally, the candidate markets they've been tapping into to bring in that talent and expertise is decreasing. So there's really this shift of power. And I really feel that actually it's really about how are schools now selling themselves to teachers, because in some degrees, the candidate has become a commodity and they have options and they've got lots of fantastic options. So really, if you're going to choose one school over another, I think it's critical, that school positioning, why you would choose them over another school down the road or in another city in the same country or even in the same region. So I definitely think there's been a huge power shift just in terms of that shortening and sort of teacher population versus an increasing international school base.
And the thing about that is one of our aims is to let people know about international education because we see it as being perhaps a better situation emotionally, let's say, and professionally for teachers in US, UK, and these other types of countries, because there are fewer restrictions on what you're doing. There's tends to be, we found, more support professionally and so on. And so it's really great to hear you saying that that's yet another reason to consider going international, is that it's a teacher's market. And so you can really have a lot of agency in the kind of place where you end up, and you can look more deeply into what, and one question that David and I have promoted for teachers to ask is, find out what is the culture at the school you're looking at. What is teacher morale like? What is the retention potential at that school? And it's great to hear you saying that teachers do have a little bit more power in that.
100%. I think the bargaining power, teachers 100% possess that. And I think they're empowered actually to make these decisions. And as I said, have options to really what's going to make the most sense for their circumstances, and really to your point of where they're going to be happiest.
Right. So let's take a look for a sec at one thing that your webinar shares, is that a lot of applicants use web search, internet resources, school websites to learn about schools. What specific kind of characteristics should applicants look for in social media accounts, articles, blogs, podcasts, and so on from schools that would indicate that schools are working to present themselves in the best light while communicating who they are?
Yeah, I think first of all, obviously, I would like to prefix my answer by saying schools come in all shapes and sizes, right? And I think dependent on what type of school, you're looking for, but where they're located, there will be these fantastic establishments who you jump on their website and it's like being on Amazon. It's really seamless to navigate and you're going to find anything you would want to find. Mm. Whereas there may be a school in a rural location who may not have that same capacity to digitally showcase themselves in the same manner. But I still think there's a few things you can look out for. And I think, first of all, I would say, how did you find out about said school? Is that a referral from a friend, from a family member, from somebody you know? And it's sort of a first-hand, well, they've told me it's great and I trust that person, which probably is the best case scenario. Yeah. If you know somebody real time who's worked there or knows somebody who's worked there, that first-hand information is always going to be really best. Then I think beyond that, it's if you found out about them really online and you've been searching around, again, where did you find their vacancies? Was it through social media? Was it direct through their school's website? Was it through a job board aggregator? And again, within that, it's quite telling where schools are advertising their vacancies, what information they're listing there. And I think that will give you a little snapshot into the position in the school, because I think that the better they do that, again, by rights, they're probably more equipped to be bringing in that international talent. They sort of know the process there. And then there's nuances like, obviously, accreditations. School accreditations are probably a good thing to look out for, because any school which goes through an accreditation process will naturally have jumped through a number of hurdles to be able to attain that. And there's these global organizations like CIS, NESAC, WASIC, which, they're fantastic. And that sort of gives you some degrees of trust, knowing that you've already had somebody almost audit them and ensure that that school's functioning and delivering excellence, and in a multiple factors. So not just in one area like their curriculum, but they will also review other areas like faculty well-being. So that's something I would definitely look into. And probably last thing as well, obviously, there's lots of great spaces where you can find out about reviews. So if you wanted to dig that little deeper and see people who've worked there before, what they've got to say about the school, there's great websites like International Schools Review. You can go on there and find out what people are saying. Now, this is my opinion, but I think, always take some of those with a pinch of salt, because, again, not like that first-hand information, it's third-hand. And really, sometimes, it might be something specific to that person and what they've gone through. It might not necessarily be indicative of the school's wider culture or anybody else. So, but again, it's still a great space to go to. And if you're seeing patterns, then, patterns usually aren't a coincidence. So I think those are some good tips to look out for.
Right. And I'd like to just add a platform that we are familiar with, which is International School Community. And it also does these kind of reviews and comparisons and things. But the difference is people attach their name to it. So it's not going to be perhaps quite as negatively biased as some of the ISR reviews. So we would like to really push that platform forward as a place for people to get. And they have pretty cool features where you can put in some of the criteria that you've mentioned and other specific criteria, salary, benefits, and so on, then compare to schools using the criteria that you've selected in your filter. So that's a pretty amazing tool they also have.
So I have a couple comments. One, I really appreciate that you brought up the point that a smaller school, potentially a school that doesn't have the personnel in media and promotions to make a great social networking feed of videos and podcasts and all that. That's really important for people to know. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we used to use that term information literacy, but we've kind of moved on to what we say information and communication literacies as plural, all these different digital literacies, is that some schools have a big department that's their job, and they're professional photographers, videographers, and they're going to put up some beautiful images and videos and tell some great stories. So you just got to be careful if it's seemingly too glossy, how to dig below that and try to get to some other information sources. Not saying anything's wrong with that, but I think that's something to take in hand as well.
I completely agree. And that international school community, it sounds like a fantastic resource, because I think, adding validity in that people are almost accountable to what they're saying, I think definitely add some more, trustworthy reviews there, as it is easy to anonymously sort of state something where there's no attachments there. But I think that's a great recommendation. And again, I completely agree with you, David, as well, that reading in between the lines is important, because schools, some do have that fantastic ability where they're going to have a function to create this amazing outlook on the school, but it doesn't necessarily always mean that's going to be way better than a school who might not have that same degrees of fantastic imagery or virtual tours of the campus. I think that's where you do have to dive a little deeper and make those connections, perhaps with other faculty or previous members of staff who could give you maybe a better insight into what life is like teaching and working in that place and school.
Definitely.
I'm just going to jump in for a second and mention LinkedIn. Working with a career coach, I learned about LinkedIn having the opportunity where you can see who's working at a school, and then perhaps you have some sort of connection with that person. So you could establish, to your point, Lloyd, of trying to talk to someone who's, real time at the school. You could figure out maybe, hey, we both have coached rugby, let's say, for example, or we both are English teachers, and then perhaps reach out and see if that person can give you some more insider information, if assuming that either you're new to international education or you just don't know anyone at that school. So that might be another way to find information, is LinkedIn.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So one of our big topics is the recruiting process. And we've done a few shows trying to help newbies coming in, new to international education, but also people who are veterans. But so far, we've really kind of had them in the hot seat. What do they have to do? How do they prepare? What kind of questions to present themselves as best they can? So again, flipping this whole discussion, I have a two-parter question for you. First, what traits should candidates expect to see in schools, as evidenced by the way their recruitment process is going and their procedures? So again, putting the emphasis on the schools showing themselves in their best light. In the second part, and I'll re-say it if we need it, but on the flip side, so apart from the absence of any of these traits that you might list, what red flags should bring up concerns for candidates about schools in how they present themselves in the recruiting process?
I think this is a really timely question as things are getting a lot more competitive. And I think if you're a school and a candidate applying for a school, from the point of application, I mean, first of all, when you're reviewing that job spec, wherever that job spec may lie, a clear breakdown of what that role entails. Now, obviously, the responsibilities of the role is important, a school and job description. But beyond that, I think even at that point, the school being able to share what benefits are involved as being a member of faculty there. What are the career progression opportunities? Are there professional development initiatives or subsidies you receive being there? So, I mean, even from the point of when you're applying to a school, you've already got a good insight into what this position is. And also beyond that, what does my career look like if I'm working for this school? And then once you've applied and schools are then reaching out to you, I think you should really be looking for a very clear and systematic communication from the school. So it shouldn't be taking weeks on end to get back to you. It should really, we encourage within 48 hours, there's a first touch point with candidates because you've taken the time to review and apply to this role. And in a similar token, you've had somebody reach back out to you and at the very least acknowledge that application. Now, beyond that, as things obviously hopefully would progress, you'd be looking for quite clear guidance on what do those next steps entail. If you're being invited for a first round interview, what does that involve? Who is that with? And again, beyond that, what are the outcomes of said interview? Is it to then go to a second round interview? Is it there a 2-step, 3-step interview process? So I think the school sharing and as a candidate looking to see and hear from a school, what does it involve when I'm applying to your school? And what is between my application to potentially getting a job offer, what's involved so that you're very well prepared. And because I've had stories where occasionally like a school will say, they're interviewing candidates and some candidates are underprepared. Now, personally, I like to dig in straight off the bat there is, well, how much did you prepare them for those interviews? Were you sharing information about what questions were going to be asked or what was going to be involved, how long it was going to be, who was attending? And very often they don't. So I think it's a two-way street. I think you have to be able to communicate that. And to go to your second point, which I'll go to in a sec, but that would then be one of my red flags. Like, has communication actually been quite poor and you don't quite know what's going on? You got an email, you jumped on with someone, you're not quite sure what the next steps are. That would for sure be a big one for me. Other ones in terms of looking out for would be, have they been able to share resources with you about, again, wider, probably, again, if it's about the school itself, like wider about the facilities or even if accommodations on-site or off-site. Maybe I've seen some great schools where they actually have like a brochure which breaks down what living looks like in their city and relative costs, again, for different apartment or house sizes, cost of living. All of these things are fantastic. So again, I think, are they sharing resources? And, ultimately as well, is there a keen interest there? I think you should feel from the very start wanted, not to just feel like you're a number or you're going to plug a gap because there's a vacancy, like feeling that they want you. And again, this is two ways, right? You're applying because it appeals to you to apply to this role in this school. But likewise, if a school's now in communication with you, you should start to feel, well, they want me as well. So I think that would be in answer to your first part of the question. I think the other second part, as I said, a red flag, sort of if communication was poor and you didn't quite know what the process was. Another one might be an inability to, if you are asking additional questions, to answer those questions or to be able to even facilitate a connection, going back to Audrey's point, with another member of staff, perhaps, if you wanted to actually speak with somebody who is already currently working there. And lastly, just, if you're feeling that it's unprofessional, often schools expect candidates to have everything in order in terms of their documentation, their resume, as I said, interview questions. Likewise, if on the flip side, some of the questions being asked of you seem a bit off or a bit peculiar, that should for sure be a red flag as well.
I really like the way you are empowering teachers to consider themselves to be in the driver's seat as much as the schools are, and to think of themselves as someone that the school should be intending to actively recruit and demonstrating that you really are the candidate of their choice and things like that. That's wonderful. So, Lloyd, we share through our website and podcast that applicants should think about building profiles for their potential school, city, country, with their own ratings of traits that can be framed as positives or negatives. What are some of the main categories that you feel applicants should include in that profile?
I often think about this. If you're relocating, as again, I'm sure many of the listeners have or intend to do so, that it's almost like a macro to micro level. That if you're thinking of a destination, I often think of, well, if you're taking and uprooting your whole life to a particular place, what are the expectations there? And I think on a wider level, you'd be looking into, do I like the climate? If I'm somebody who likes hot weather and it's a place which is generally cold year round, then might not be for me. But also things like laws, the culture there, the political beliefs. I think there's some things to consider when you're looking at a country level, just so you know kind of what am I getting in for, and is this a fit for me? And perhaps if you're traveling solo or with a family, again, that probably has wider implications as well. And then when I go to cities, because some countries, go back to the climate point, one city in the north might have fantastic weather and a city in the south might have awful weather, or vice versa. So I think on a city point of view, I would then sort of dig into what is life like living in this city? What's the cost of living? Again, going back to accommodation, what does that look like? How big is the city? Because again, if you're somebody who doesn't like the hustle bustle and there's 20 million people there, might not be for you if you're looking for a slower walk or pace of life. So I think those are good considerations. And obviously transport links as well, because we know from our surveys that the number one motivating factor still for teachers looking to teach overseas is the travel and experience component. So looking at that, unless you want to be sort of isolated in a very rural area, because again, that's what you're looking for, and you want to be immersed into this very rich cultural experience in a particular destination, then I think I would be looking at, if I'm thinking, well, I really want to go to Asia, we've always wanted to travel to Hong Kong, to Singapore, to Japan, then I'm thinking to myself, how easy is it for me to get to these places?
Right.
Because that's certainly going to be food for thought once you're there. And lastly, at the school level, then I think it's more actually due to the school itself. So, the size of the school. So it depends on what you're looking for. There's very large schools out there. There's very small schools out there. The institution type. So is it private? Is it public? I think that's an important distinction to make. Class size, I know that's important. Probably curriculum being delivered. So again, if you've got experience with that or not. What we've seen a lot recently with the shift in certainly the student population and the ratios of the faculty to student populace, knowing that the student populace is vastly locals, more and more schools now are really making it a key initiative to look into DEI work and balancing the ratios actually of faculty. So one thing I think is also a fantastic point to look at is, do they have diversity initiatives? Do they have a diversity policy or statement? The representation of that school staff, what does that look like? And I think that's very important, because everybody wants to feel that you're going to be able to assimilate well and there's a healthy environment for you. So I think it's really good to see that there's a lot more emphasis being put on this work. And I think that's another really important area to look at, is looking at that diversity piece as well, and what does that look like at the school? And then little things like, what are the perks the school's offering to their staff members? We talked about sort of career progression, professional development, even compensation to a degree. But even beyond that, perhaps there's some smaller perks which could be great to some people, an on-site gym or facilities, things like that, I think are becoming more and more of a consideration as schools are more competitive. And the benchmarks are very similar if they're in the same location. So yeah, I think just going from a very high level all the way to more granular, looking at all these facets and relating it back to yourself and what are you looking for.
On the transport, let me take that to the micro level, and I'm probably going to repeat this a lot as we do our episodes. So when we look at the cost benefits of living in a place, if it's possible that there's good public transportation or easy to walk to the school. In like where I am, you can use Grab, which is like Uber, things like that. That really can make a big difference for a family because I've got a couple nightmare stories of buying cars and trying to sell cars and all that good stuff. So I'll just add that to the conversation. And just a quick side note, diversity, so many ramifications. But as a fellow from the South in one of my first schools in the 90s, I met these different people from the country of Canada who
Woohoo!
I had not met before. And I met some
Talk
from
about diversity.
Australians and yeah, and New Zealand. What was so interesting about them as individuals was part of that culture they brought with them. But in those days was the curriculum and instructional high-poweredness that they brought. They just like, wow, these people know a lot more than I do. So, I felt pretty good about getting to know my new friends.
Yeah. I think the very definition of an international school is you want to see that reflected in every regard at the school.
Right?
And yeah, I think that's, to David's point, culturally, if you're able to have representation from a global perspective, then you're able to then convey that to your students who also, that's why they're there. They're ultimately looking for global perspectives. So I think it's, so important having cross sections of cultures, nationalities, backgrounds, because by definition, I think that's really, what an international school is looking to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to go in a slightly different direction, but along a similar line. One of the things David and I have also talked about a lot is, do you consider yourself more a tourist or more a traveler? And so I'm really not sure, honestly, how you can find this out other than a personal connection. But is this the type of place where you're going to be living in a bubble and not really getting into local culture or making local connections? Or is this going to be the kind of place where there are multiple opportunities for you to kind of get out in the community and go beyond just the school experience? And so depending how important that is to a prospective teacher, that's something that you might also want to see if you can suss out somehow.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Nice one, partner. That is huge. And right now I'm working on a few blog posts, and one of them is taking this idea of preparing like a spreadsheet that is a template for profiles of the school, the city, and the nation. And Audrey, I'm going to add that one to the list of, is it a bubble kind of place that you live in, and how can you spread your wings and things like that? So excellent point. All right. So let's move on to, and listening to your webinar, you mentioned teacher satisfaction. And I just kind of step back and go, wow, that's pretty cool. Thinking about teacher satisfaction and someone trying to hire me or hiring new people and really concerned about that. So I appreciated that you were highlighting the need for schools to communicate how they support teacher satisfaction and well-being. So we have a couple questions for you. And the first is, I can see an applicant full of agency and confidence ask, what are ways your leadership team and the community support teacher well-being and satisfaction? What then should the candidate look for in answers from the recruiter?
Yeah, I think as I was mentioning earlier, I think teacher well-being is probably the buzzword right now. And certainly, as I said, because with teachers leaving the profession and it becoming more competitive, I think that's the outlier. If your teacher satisfaction levels are incredibly high and teachers love working there, your retention's super high, and when you do need to recruit, let's say through natural attrition, you've got staff members who are almost flying the flag for you because it's such a wonderful place to work, I think it's really key. And I think if you're an applicant applying for something and you're curious of like, well, what do you do at your school to ensure, or cater towards teacher well-being, then first of all, I think more and more schools are operating in the sense when I say like a business, I mean in terms of how businesses have probably naturally treated their employees for a long time, which is if you're in a space, especially a competitive space, why would you choose to work here over another company or a competitor? And often it's that environment. And also the relationship you have with other staff and direct management is massive as well. So first of all, are you getting frequent checking points? at that school. Now, whether that's with, a HR manager or director, whether that's with the school leadership, but is somebody actually coming to you and listening to you and hearing about what you're enjoying, what you're finding challenging, what you're looking to do? Because again, that feedback loop is incredibly important, because I think where people become most frustrated is when you feel like you don't have an avenue to voice your thoughts and have a voice. So I think, first of all, if you're hearing things like they have this sort of system in place where they have review meetings with teachers, or they have feedbacks or surveys where they actually go out and ask for the opinions and thoughts of their staff, first of all, I think that's incredibly important. And then naturally, there's things like, what resources are they providing you when you're at that school? So do you have what you need? Because we know, again, one of the high factors when you look at dissatisfaction is because teachers feel under-resourced. You feel like, my out of hours, I'm here creating resources for my class tomorrow. So that's another important aspect. Like, how well actually are you being supported to do your role as well, to be successful? And then if you're an incoming teacher, do they have support groups for incoming teachers where they're connecting with you, the wider group of incoming teachers, or even current members of staff who can answer questions like, how do I open a bank account there? How do I get a phone? How do I travel to the school? Going back to your point, David, do I need a taxi, a tube, a car, a bike? And lastly, just the wider perks. And I think, this day and age, mental health is talked about a lot, rightfully so. So again, I mean, I can speak to like our organization, but for instance, we have Calm, which I believe is quite popular these days, but it's a place where if somebody does need, because not everybody can have obviously a counselor or somebody on site you could speak to directly. But again, if it's just meditation and podcasts and things which can help you in those moments of stress, again, that's a lovely resource to have, and to acknowledge that teaching is stressful. Like most lines of work can be stressful. So how do you reduce that stress, and how do you have outlets where people can go to cater towards if they are feeling uneasy? So that's what I'd probably share.
I love that you dove into the wellness piece, because that's David's big thing. I'm just going to take a little sidestep and just throw this out to anyone out there who is a head of school or admin, that two things that I've appreciated in past schools, just in terms of taking the temperature of the school, the teachers, in terms of how they're feeling. Two things I've seen and I thought were quite successful. One was to have some sort of faculty senate or council where teachers can write in and provide feedback for the head of school, and then the council meets and discusses these things, and they always have to be applicable to the whole school. So it's not just a chance for people to moan and complain, but it's representation without the discomfort. Some people feel uncomfortable bringing forward something that they're unhappy about when it's going to be attached to them directly, because they don't want to come across as a complainer. But when you have this outlet, this opportunity to bring forward issues that are more broadly felt by staff members, I feel like that gives you a little feeling that you have some voice. And then the other thing is surveys, where admins send out a survey, and some fantastic heads of school where I've been have stood up in front of the school and said, here are the things on the survey that you've brought forward, and here's how I'm going to address them. And I just think that's fantastic. Lloyd, when you talk about transparency, I think the ability to express humility and to have this openness to wanting to improve can really boost staff morale when they feel as though they're being heard. So I think those are two devices that a school could use very effectively to help with staff morale.
And Lloyd, you kind of took care of the second part of the question, because my question was, what questions could you ask the recruiting team about how they support well-being and satisfaction? So you presented it in a form of questions. And then I'll add a third point on to Audrey's too right there, because yes, wellness is something very important to me. And my background is with positive psychology and finding a way to bring the PERMA pillars, if you know positive psychology, and the character strengths into the culture of a school. So I would come right out and ask people, if I was out recruiting, I would say, please lay out your wellness plan. I'd keep it pretty open-ended at first because they're going to jump right in. We're doing this for kids. We're doing kids. And if they're not talking about teachers, then that's going to tell you something. And then if it was me, I'd want to hear them talking about parents and families. So that's a whole nother discussion. We will have episodes on that, but that's something I would look for as well.
I think all of those are fantastic points. I think the humility, transparency with any working relationship is key because, yes, at the end of the day, if you're a head of school, a principal, superintendent, there's a lot of things, and I think there is a lot of focus put towards the student body, but at the same time, your faculty should just be top of mind in the same line of thinking. And I think too often that mistake's made where they think about a lot of these things and actionable takeaways when they're thinking about students, but they very often forget to say, well, does this also apply to our staff? And, is there something we could do to actually enrich the culture across every level? So I think those points are really great, and actually some food for thought for me as we enter probably surveys in which we ask and look into well-being. I think those are some fantastic points you laid out there, David, and to potentially build into some of our own when we aggregate the teachers who are teaching internationally, what they're thinking about and what do they consider and what's important to them. I think going deeper into that well-being piece is probably critical to seeing success once you're there.
When I also want to mention that teachers, as a rule, are in it for the vocation, not, they're giving people, they're caring people. Service is typically a big part of their MO. And so often all that's needed is to feel that you're being heard, to feel that you matter. And these, all the ways we've mentioned are ways to get that message across. And I do think that's super important. All we need is a pat on the back sometimes. And all the things that you've talked about being in place can convey the message that, yes, we do care about teacher wellness. Love it. So moving to a related question, onboarding and orientation are really critical to transition staff into a new school, city, country. So what kind of components of onboarding and orientation should candidates expect to hear recruiters talking about?
Onboarding, again, I think an area schools are really investing into because knowing that has a direct correlation to retention very often. Now, I think to start with, I think onboarding shouldn't start when you arrive in country in August and you go to the school and they're, arranging a meeting to start that process. I think that process should have started way before that.
Yes, please.
And I think it really, at the point you've accepted an offer with a school, you're immediately entering into that onboarding process. So, and arguably, you can support that even beforehand. But as you enter, and let's say it's your first time, you've never taught in this location, let's say you're not living in X location either, then it could have been your first time. Naturally, everybody's nervous about uprooting themselves and moving to a completely new place where everything could change. So what can you share with them, even pre-departure, to help them start to, even if it's project that assimilation of where they're going to live? So when I was talking about schools who can share and accommodation breakdown, so for instance, if it is off-site, and let's say you're given an allowance, but you yourself will be going to find your accommodation, then within that, they can already give you some common or popular areas to look at. So you can say, well, hey, based on your circumstances, some of our other teachers have suggested these locations, we can help you take a look and even in advance connect you with HR if you'd be looking to live in one of these places and find a property. It could be things like visa support is really critical because I think there's quite a lot of red tape and country to country, the visa process is very different and documentation required is one thing, but there usually ends up with quite a lot of back and forth. So when you're going through the process of attestating your documents or you're in touch with one of these visa providers, because often schools will use those to issue the work permits. Them being able to clearly communicate, hey, this is what you're going to need. This is how you do it. Here's your local embassy. There's a lot of things they can share to help you with that. And then even going through the onboarding, I think if you're going to an area where the language spoken, despite your school maybe using English as the medium of instruction, you might be living in a place where English is not widely spoken. And perhaps, obviously, we've got David in Vietnam. That was one example, but there's many examples worldwide. You could be moving to the Middle East, and obviously Arabic is going to be the dominating language. China, Mandarin will be. So I think if you're jumping in a taxi from that airport from day dot, maybe the person doesn't understand English, and rather than you sort of fiendishly trying to type into your phone and translate, sometimes I think a basic language immersion course can be really helpful. And some of that, again, can be provided pre-departure. But I think it's especially important if it hasn't been, once somebody's arriving, this is to help them assimilate. So if you're making an Uber Eats delivery, you know how to basically say, well, hey, we're upstairs or we're on floor 3. Or if you're getting in a taxi, you can simply say, this is where I'm going. And then, again, as I was saying before, I think like groups, forums, spaces whereby you can connect with other people who can help you as well. So if you've got any questions, any reservations, concerns, you can share those, and somebody's probably been there, they've been in your shoes, and they can tell you what they did or what they found helpful or give you some options. So again, it can be as easy as that. Like if you facilitate that communication pathway, then there's other people probably at your school who can help those people with many things they probably have in their head and they may not asked yet, because some things seem trivial. But again, if you get an answer to it, it just relieves that sort of, pressure of going, oh, okay, now I know, that's okay. We know what we're going to do there. So I think there's a whole host of things. I'm sure the list goes way beyond that. But those are some of the things I think are definitely important from the school's perspective, what they should be providing almost as a basic.
Yes, and that onboarding, as you're saying, should start right after the person's hired in the spring. And then the onboarding morphs into the orientation. There's kind of a crossover area when you land. And one of the things I would put in a pitch for, and you said it earlier, is in the old days, we would get a handbook, like an orientation handbook. But one of the things I did for one of my schools years ago is I built a website that had the doctor's list, the dentist list, where you can go shop. And now, we've got Google Maps and all that. So I would say for the candidates, asking to say, do you have a digital handbook? Do you have a web portal? So that I'm a earnest person. I want to look at these orientation things that you're going to show me in August. I want to look at them ahead of time. And just like you said, in today's world, connect to everyone on WhatsApp, whatever the communication app is, to make that connection. So I would add all of that to the mix. All right, so let's move to another term that you used. And I used to be in instructional technology. We use the term branding yourself as an educator. This is from years in the past, so that word gets out on who you are and what skills you have and things like that. And schools do have a brand, a persona, to communicate the different aspects of who they are, but also you talked about the brand connecting to the city and how to make that country stand out. So I'm guessing candidates can ask, please tell me about your school brand. What makes your school, city, country stand out? So what kind of responses should they get?
Another great question I think candidates should definitely ask a school, because it will give you probably a much better insight into how do they view what life is like at their school. Now, I think what you would probably end up having, and a lot of times is schools probably talking about their reputation or their accreditations they have, or even standing in the education community, which, don't get me wrong, can be important. But I think as an inbound member of staff, you're looking to really dig into what is it actually like living and working there. And a lot of those things don't really influence or affect that. So I think, an example I often say to schools is a good one. We had worked with a school in Andorra. Now, personally, at my naivety, I didn't know barely anything about Andorra. And straight away, though, the school sort of was positioning that teachers who come and work for their school tend to be a lover of the outdoors, because now I know much more, but it's situated perfectly in the Pyrenees, I believe, between France and Spain, the mountains. And if you love skiing, I think they have snow most of the year. It's the place to be for you. And you're going to love that. The school is on the doorstep of a range. So to me, these are all these selling points that if I was a candidate, and that sounds incredible to me because I'm an avid skier, or I absolutely love skiing. Now already I'm getting this feel for, oh, the school's a stone's throw from an activity I would love doing, as often as possible. So I think that is one example where I think schools should be able to answer what's great about working there, what's in and around them, what would you see, what could you go and experience or do, and whether that's culture related, whether that's transport, because they may be in a good hub where you can get to different places. But I think it should be like, what can I expect if I get here? And then that way, that attaches to a lot of what we talk about candidate personas, but that attaches to that because you can align your expectations, what you're looking for, and likewise from the school's point of view. So that matchmaking process happens much better rather than just saying, oh yeah, we're a fantastic school, we have X, Y, and Z. And, the candidate, I haven't actually learned that much from that. I just know you're obviously a very well-regarded school, but that hasn't really given me much into, if I went and taught there, what would I expect? What would I enjoy? What would I dislike? You haven't had a chance to think about that. So I think schools should communicate their brand in the sense of, in a way, their value propositions. Like, why would somebody choose you?
It almost sounds like somebody could make an app where candidates could put in their profile and schools could put in their profile, and then you could see if it was a match, not just in terms of the things we typically look at, but maybe go a little beyond. So that's a pretty cool concept of matching the brands and the personas. We, on a slightly different note, strongly believe in the value of systems at a school. And we've been really fortunate over the years, both of us feel that we have, to work at some schools with really solid systems in place. And what I mean by that is that a teacher comes in with an initiative, maybe a new curriculum idea, and then when that teacher leaves, does that stay in place? Does that idea or that plan continue on or not? And systems really help with that. So tell us maybe about whether this would be a reasonable question for a candidate to ask. Tell me about the systems in place at your school that you are most proud of. And if that is a good question, then what do you think would be some helpful answers for them to hear from the schools?
Yeah, I think it would be a great question to ask. Again, it sort of goes back to that voice aspect of if you are especially somebody who likes to have an impact at the school you're working on, you have ideas, you want to influence to create a better environment for all, then I think the answer they should expect is, firstly, asking them, are there examples whereby they could share whether it's been an idea, what's been implemented, and regardless of where that's come from, a few of these things they've created into systems, to your point. So it may have started out as an idea by one individual, but how has that then become embodied at the school? And I think, what did they do? So sharing an example, like what improvement were they looking to tackle when they came around with that idea? Like what was the issue sort of identified where that could help? I would look at what impact it made. So is there actually, it doesn't always have to be statistical, but is there anecdotal feedback of the influence and change that had, and why actually it was such a fantastic thing that they either rolled that out at a much wider level and were able to systemize that because they saw it had a fantastic ability. I can actually think of an example as I'm saying this, because my wife, she's a primary school teacher, and when she taught in China, she had worked at a lot of schools in Scotland where behavioral issues were a concern. And here in the UK, I think the get out clause is you sort of rescind somebody's recess time. They're not allowed to play outside, and they sort of stay in the classroom, and then you sit there for half an hour and you move on. Whereas they were in China, to be honest with you, I think behavior issues aren't much of a thing because generally speaking, they're very well behaved. Mm-hmm. But of those who do, they looked at like a project whereby rather than just looking at not allowing the child to play or be with their other students or friends. It was to look at like a remediation. So, they had a little session. It was more of like a lunch and learn. So they would be able to sit down, the students, for 10 to 15 minutes, talk about the issue if there was an issue, discuss that with them one-on-one, and then allow them back out. Now, they ended up, that worked really well for them and started out as a small idea for one class, and it ended up across the whole primary school. So I think those examples where schools can actually tell you of things which they've done in the past, how it's helped, why they did it, and so that they're very open to feedback, and that as a member of staff, you're able to have an impact if you've got ideas, if there's from your previous experiences you're bringing. I'm always a big believer in everybody has their own skill sets and strengths. So, naturally, we should probably be learning from each other. Everybody's going to have a great take on something. So, yeah, that would be something I would look out for.
And also, it's wonderful to feel, maybe it's a bit egotistical, but that you are able to leave a bit of a legacy somewhere, and that you've made that impact and it is ongoing rather than this huge effort and it kind of becomes a one-off. So that's also a nice thing to know.
I'm going to take your response, and I really appreciated what you said, and it really gets down into the weeds rather nicely, where I like to go sometimes. Because we have something in international schools called initiative fatigue, that several of these schools, whether they're the powerhouse schools or up-and-coming schools, can get too many things going on and people just kind of throw up their arms. And what I think gets so frustrating is when they don't see the follow-through, because it's one thing to bring in the expert, do all the big PD, everyone learns, but then the lack of follow-through, implementation, and how you started your answer, some kind of data to tell you if it's working. So to our listeners, I'm going to add this one to our profile list as well, about asking what's happening with initiatives, how many things do you have going on, and can you give me evidence that it's working? So I'll add that to that discussion. All right, we are running long, so let's see if we can zip through this. Let's take a quick look at professional learning, and what we're going to look for in schools is the money there, is the training, is the biggest one is time. But one of the things that you said in your webinar that really caught my interest, and let's just drill down on this, is growing their own, where schools with their professional development grow their own. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so one of our services is we have an alternative teacher certification program, and alongside that, a teacher development program. Now, firstly, when we look at the concept of growing your own, is how are you, first of all, perhaps taking positions like TAs and parapros and being able to facilitate their career progression, perhaps into a classroom as a licensed teacher. And then beyond that, continuous development. So again, you're looking at teachers then into, perhaps it's starting as head of grade leaders or head of departments, but beyond into SLT positions at school. So just this concept of growing your own is that rather than externally always looking to recruit various positions, how can you actually facilitate pathways in-house and at all levels? So there's fantastic programs out there where you can do that, and it's very functional professional development where it's not just a course. There's really an outcome there, and the outcome might be that you're able to attain a different level of position. You can increase your earning power, something which is important. So I just think the concept of why we call it grow your own is how are you actually building in-house as opposed to always looking externally for whether it's your teachers, SLT, whoever it may be.
And that's just such a nice offer for some teachers at different parts of their career, to see that, especially as young teachers coming in maybe without a lot of experience, to say, this is a place that's going to be very fertile. I can grow. I can maybe move into leadership or something like that. I really appreciate that terminology.
All right. Well, we're trying to be mindful of your time, so maybe we can just wrap up if you tell us about Teachaway, which is how we connected. Tell us about Teachaway's mission and services.
Yeah, of course. So I've been here over 7 years now, but the company itself has been around 2 decades now, and their vision's always been that every student deserves the power of a great teacher. Now, naturally, most of our services are all geared around that. So whether it's recruitment, whether it's certification development, it's all geared towards helping an educator progress their careers, and actually that life cycle as an educator, having somewhere to go, whether it's to attain a new position, whether it's to progress in your current position. So we're able to, if there are listeners out there, they're looking for a new job or they're looking to grow, they're more than welcome to check us out. You'll find lots of information through our website towards that. But again, we're sort of, I think, like a lot of people, naturally, as you were saying earlier, Audrey, that it's still vocational. At the end of the day, the students, most teachers get into the profession because they do want to help and they want to be role models and they want to really have an impact on those next generations. So again, it's a similar vision we have here at Teachaway.
And with Teachaway, folks can go to the website. We'll have it in our show notes. And they also can contact you on LinkedIn. That's one of the things we always want to offer to our listeners on how to contact the guest. So, Lloyd, this has been so informative, and it's really been a lifter for my spirits, thinking in terms of teachers and people wanting to be administrators, looking at this whole world of recruiting and shifting schools in a new light and a stronger position. So thank you so much for taking the time. We know you've got to hit the road. You've got a conference to go to, but it's been invaluable what you've shared with us.
Yes, thank you so much, Lloyd. You're so informed and knowledgeable, and we really appreciate it.
Likewise, it's been an absolute pleasure to be on here with you both. And, your insights have helped me today as well. So as I was saying, it's a two-way street. It's been a two-way street. So I appreciate your efforts as well and having me on here in the first place.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
and David,
inviting you to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.